Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. In this one I want to talk about Avatar Zalir, the newly revealed Avatar from the Reckoning of Roku novel, and also one of the details about her is that we find out that she is a pre-Four Nations Avatar. So most of the discussion actually is going to be about sort of that timeline kind of distinction and what that actually means. What era are we talking about there for a pre-Four Nations Avatar? But let's jump into it here. So yes, Avatar Zalir revealed in the Reckoning of Roku as a new past Avatar. The books have been doing this over their runs. We've learned more about Avatar Zito. We've got the name of Avatar Zalir. We've got a little bit of detail on Avatar Gun. With the idea being that it seems like most of these avatars are kind of from that era. They're all relatively close to the more modern avatars that we know about, and it doesn't really seem that any of them go back way too far. But clearly here, with the description that we have for Avatar Zalir, she is more of an ancient avatar, but not going all the way back to one, but just in this kind of interesting mid-ground where it's pre-Four Nations, so it's still old, but not that old. So yeah, she's pre-Four Nations, she's a fire avatar, but also, you know, because she's pre-Four Nations, this means pre-Fire Nation, and that's a significant detail for, I think, the character arc, and in a way, why? What use do they make out of revealing Avatar Zalir in a Roku novel? We'll get to that. Obviously, Wan is also another example of a fire avatar who is pre-Four Nations, pre-Fire Nation. But with Wan, we go back to like a whole other era. This is like before any nation exists. And that's an interesting distinction to make of like people lived on the backs of lion turtles, and then towards the end of Wan's life, I think we begin to maybe see the very early beginnings of some of the nations. But it's so early, you can't truly call them the Four Nations. Whereas we're talking about pre the Four Nations as we know them in the modern era, and the idea that there is this giant chunk of time between this and the kind of era that we're talking about where the nations really take shape. And it does take place over a very large amount of time. Now, as far as confirmation goes, on what this is, we'll address the text with Avatar Zalir, but I do want to bring up straight away that Randy Rabai on Instagram did say that, in his view, she is a pre-Four Nations avatar. Now, he says headcanon, but like, what does that really mean when he is the author of the book? He wrote that detail in there. I take it to just be that ultimately, as we'll get to, while we have some information about what pre-Four Nations actually means, they don't want to super heavily lock Zalir to a specific time frame here, and so he's maybe being a little bit vague about it, but clearly the author's intent behind that mention in the book, Zalir, is to have an older avatar who is pre-Four Nations. So you can, you know, disagree with this because he says headcanon, but I take this to be partial, you know, confirmation of it. But as we address here in the text also makes it kind of pretty clear what's going on here. Sister Disha stopped in front of a statue of Avatar Zalir toward the back of the sanctuary. She was a short-haired, athletically built woman in a sleeveless tunic and a patterned tolgay, a type of hand-woven wraparound skirt that was worn in the days before the Fire Nation, when the archipelago was a loose collection of small clans scattered throughout the Fire Islands. So, straight away, we're talking about the Southern Air Temple Sanctuary here with the statues. We saw this in Avatar, and we also saw it in Korra. It's the spiral organization of Avatar statues that eventually goes up the walls. And the Zalir statue is said to be towards the back of the sanctuary, which means the whole spiral goes outwards before we get to Zalir. So straight away, that tells us that she's quite a bit further back, because if you look at a lot of the shots, that spiral gets through a lot of avatars. So we're quite a long way away from some of the more recent avatars, certainly. Then we just get a description of her, short-haired, athletically built, with the significant detail being what she's wearing, this tolge. This will be referenced later on in the book in relation to the new island that we go to, Lombok Island, that the people there also wear patterned tolge. But the significance is this clothing is known for being worn in the days before the Fire Nation. So that's good. We're in an era where at the very least one of the nations hasn't properly formed yet, meaning it's pre-Four Nations. When it was just Fire Islands. And we know about this, and we'll get into that detail here when it comes to talking about the comics in a second, of course. But I'll address that, just the other point from the book. Roku, when he gets to the island, it is noted that one of the characters, Malaya, wears a tolge, but also everyone else in the clan basically wears similar clothing. We see here two women, one man, and the woman wear tolge skirts and the man wears a wano loincloth. And again, it describes that these are traditional red, black and gold patterns of the Fire Islands, but it had been hundreds, if not thousands of years since any clan in the Fire Nation had dressed like that outside of historical reenactments or theatrical performances. So one of the obvious reasons that the book actually has this little detail randomly with a past avatar is to make this connection that the island, Lombok Island, is the big detail in the book, is to highlight that you should be thinking about more ancient avatars. You should be thinking that, yes, when they talk about this island as being kind of lost from the world, they've cut off contact with the world for so long, they keep themselves hidden. It has been a very long time. It has been hundreds, and it realistically is thousands of years since they've truly interacted with the outside world. And so it's this kind of double confirmation of that helps you confirm Zalir is an older avatar, but Zalir also helps you to confirm that the island very much is separated from the world for that long. So before we get into, we'll get into Pre-Four Nation in, I suppose, just a second. A few of the other reasons why Zalir does get brought up here is that it's definitely to highlight the idea that the role of the Avatar predates the nations that we know, as we know them in Roku's era. You know, the idea that previous fire avatars, like Avatar Zito especially, has been criticized historically for being kind of too attached to his nation, being maybe too loyal to the Fire Lord. There's always that kind of bias potentially there with the recent fire avatars. But this bias doesn't go all the way back, because the Avatar eventually predates the formation of the Fire Nation. So there are avatars, fire avatars, that had no Fire Lord to deal with, because it's during a time when it was just those fire islands that we talk about. So the whole point, I think, of Avatar Zalir being an avatar whose statue is depicted as wearing this more island-style clothing is that, I guess she comes from one of these islands. It's during a time well before we get the modern clothing that we know the Fire Nation is having. And that is an interesting detail for Roku, who is trying to really separate himself from being the Fire National, to expand his horizons, to really see things from a multi-nation kind of point of view. And that's something he gets to at the end of the book through interacting with the island. He realizes this isolated island needs to continue its independence, and that's part kind of the arc, is in a way realizing that, yeah, the nation borders is a thing that has happened in history, and it's a very locked in thing that we know of from more recent eras. There was a time before the nations, and so those borders maybe aren't as locked in historically for all time as you maybe think they are, and that is very much the case. So yes, Pre-Four Nations and the Lombok connection I already went over. And now let's address what Pre-Four Nations actually means, because I think you get a rough sense. Like the Fire Island example, I think, and pre-Fire Nation certainly helps things. I think Wan, and the fact that we have this historical kind of moment from the end of Wan's era, where we get a sense for this war between the early stages of at least 3 of the 4 nations, I'm guessing at least sets the stage for where specific groups of people are in the world, with the idea being that my assumption would be that the early Earth Kingdom probably win this war, so they claim the main landmass of the world for themselves, eventually to become the Earth Kingdom. The maybe losing Fire Nation retreat to the islands, and claims them for themselves, and that causes all these wars that we're about to talk about to happen. The Water Tribe potentially retreats up north to form the Northern Water Tribe, because we know the South comes a bit afterwards. With the idea being that the air nomads don't seem to get involved in this, potentially, or they're maybe more on the outskirts of this. And we know that the air nomads, from beginnings to more modern time period, have been very, very kind of similar the whole way through. Little evolutions here and there, but it's a very kind of clean history for the air nomads, it seems. So let's address this. So scroll up to the start here with how old is pre-Four Nations and how do we get to this conclusion? The answer, in case you're wondering, is 4,000 years before Korra. As in, at the very least, we know that the era that is 4,000 years before Korra is considered pre-Four Nations. We don't know exactly when this suddenly stops and it transitions to suddenly we are the Four Nations now. It just is that at the very least 4,000 years is the case. So it could still be the case that like 3,000 years before Korra, it's still pre-Four Nations. 2,000 years, it's still pre-Four Nations. Just keep that in mind the whole way through, because we ultimately don't have super clear, super concrete information that just tells us what pre-Four Nations is. The connection here is surprisingly detailed to get to even this conclusion. So the starting point for this is Zier in A Breath of Fresh Air. That's Korra, Book 3, Episode 1. He tells us this. Guru Lahima lived 4,000 years ago in the Northern Air Temple. The rest of the quote doesn't particularly matter. It's just extra details on Lahima. Though I suppose the fact that it's in the Northern Air Temple is sort of interesting to note. And the idea that they do mention that he lived the final 40 years of his life, that sort of idea. But the key point that they're kind of highlighting here is that Lahima is 4,000 years before Korra's era. We don't get that many references to specific thousands of years ago in Avatar, so that's what we're doing here. But how do we then connect this to, for sure, it's pre-Four Nations? Otherwise, does anything really suggest Lahima is Four Nations? Because, like, they have the Northern Air Temple already, so clearly the air nomads are kind of there already. This is where the rise of Kyoshi comes in, and a lot of this is around the character Lao Ge, who fans of course know is a super interesting, fascinating, legendary character. He's also known as Tiegwai the Immortal, with the immortal kind of tagline being because his age basically seemingly ranges from being at least 200 years old to potentially being multiple thousands of years old, with again the connection here being 4,000, as we'll get to. Now, obviously, we'll address it kind of here immediately in the first bit of text from The Rise of Kyoshi. Kyoshi has a journal from her mother that has information. Her mother is also familiar with Lao Ge, and so she knows stuff about him and highlights the idea that the journal didn't have that much detail. It said you were an underworld legend rumored to be 200 years old, but that's obviously a tall tale. Now, this is obviously funny as the audience kind of looking at this here, because we know Kyoshi goes on to live to be 230 years old. So it's not a tall tale that someone could live to be 200 years old, let alone kind of longer. The point is that eventually, from Lao Ge, Kyoshi will learn how he lived this long and learn to do that herself using the kind of immortality kind of meditation style technique, which we won't really get into here, but that's an important kind of detail that's just interesting to note. In a later discussion, Lao Ge talks to Kyoshi about Guru Shoken, who is a fellow philosopher, but the key point is that a contemporary of Guru Lahima, as in Guru Lahima and Guru Shoken were alive at the same time. They're from the same era. So 4,000 years ago is Guru Lahima, but it's also Guru Shoken, that connection. And we just get that here. Yeah, contemporary of Lahima's, not as popular though, so kind of maybe a little bit obscure. Not many people know him, that sort of idea. Then Kyoshi tries to make a few connections here. She knows that he has this kind of immortal kind of nickname here, and now he knows all this other information. So she asked the question we're all thinking: are you him? Are you Shokan? But that detail doesn't really matter. It's just what she says here. If her wild accusation was right, it would have made the man before her older than the four nations themselves. So straight away, just the idea of Shokan being from the same era as Lahima, that means that era is pre-Four Nations. And we know that that era is 4,000 years before Korra. Thus, 4,000 years before Korra is before the Four Nations. That's the connection that's being made here. Now, Lao Ge says, of course not, as in, I'm not Shokan. I was always much better looking than that fool. So he kind of, there's a bit of joking kind of going on here where he says no, but then he's like, but no, I was around at the same time, but am I? So this is where the idea is, if that's true, and he actually does know or did know Shokan, that means he is 4,000 years old. And that's where that dynamic sort of comes from as well. And knowing the crazy advanced age that Lao Ge could be. Also, this is where this detail gets explained to us. But yeah, either way, even the whole Lao Ge thing is a lie, the connection of 4,000 years being pre-Four Nations is still very much here. So yeah, that's it in as clear wording as possible. 4,000-ish years pre-Korra is confirmed to be pre the Four Nations. Now again, that is not to say that 3,000 years before Korra is not also pre the Four Nations. We just don't have any specific details to tell us that or not tell us that just yet, because we have so few points on the timeline when we talk about this. The other detail to get into is the idea of, like, we're talking about this specific point in time where apparently officially this is where the Four Nations are the Four Nations as we know them. The map that we often have of basically the Kyoshi Roku 100-Year War era. Like, what does that mean? And then what does it mean to be pre-Four Nations? When we talk about pre-Four Nations, we're not saying that, like, all of Fire Nation, Water Tribes, Earth Kingdom, Air Temples, Air Nomads, I'm not saying that all of that stuff doesn't exist. It's just that one of them is not quite in the same place that we know it to be in modern eras, basically. The idea that each of these Four Nations has their own individual history. And as we'll get into some details here, some of them do have set points where very clearly, historically, there is a point at which they are what they are in modern times. But before that, can you really call it the Four Nations as we know them overall? So we just get the idea that yes, this established, more clear set Four Nations as we know on the map is something that has happened in the last 4,000 years. Basically just to highlight the point that at the very least there are 6,000 years from Wan to whenever the Four Nations established themselves where it's not really the Four Nations. There might be Four Nations, but are they the Four Nations? That kind of distinction. The first point I want to make is smoke and shadow when it comes to the Fire Nation. We know the Fire Nation only became the Fire Nation after a long period of fighting, of warlords from different fire islands fighting for control, with the first Fire Lord eventually uniting them into the Fire Nation. You can see some of that here. This flashback to the kind of warlord Tuz and his kind of cruel campaign and what he did, how he terrorized the Fire Islands, of course. And then eventually the idea of that this was broken by the first Fire Lord coming into play, unifying everything, bringing the warlords to justice, creating a certain amount of peace within the Fire Nation. And we've never known specifically when this takes place. Just that it's after Wan, but it could be kind of anywhere up to a huge amount of time. Now that we know what pre-Four Nations is, it gives us a bit of a sense where, like, what if the Fire Nation was the last of the Four Nations to kind of properly become their modern kind of iteration in this time? The unification of the Fire Nation eventually leads maybe to the Four Nations actually happening. That's a potential idea. The other one is, what about the Water Tribes? We know the Southern Water Tribe only forms at a later point after the Northern Water Tribe is formed. Initially, there's only one Water Tribe, the Northern Tribe, and then because of issues there, the South splinters off, and then from the South, the Foggy Swamp Tribe also splinters off. So is it the case that the Water Tribes are only the Water Tribes plural, which is, they are called Water Tribes in the Four Nations? So can the Four Nations only exist once we for sure have our Southern Water Tribe? That's an interesting detail as well. And I would say the air nomads are maybe the only ones where maybe you can't talk about it too much, but like the formation maybe of all four air temples, like I don't think know historically too much about that. But otherwise they've been pretty consistent over the kind of generations. The Earth Kingdom, you know, you assume like it's been the kind of messy giant nation at the center of the world for like most of the kind of time period. But you do have key moments of just like, say, in modern days, the capital is Ba Sing Se. But there was a time when Ba Sing Se didn't have those walls. There was a time when Ba Sing Se was a older underground town, basically. Hence the Crystal Catacombs. That's what it originally was. And so kind of Omashu is its sort of like historical main city. Because that's obviously where a lot of the earthbending form origin with the badger moles and stuff like that comes from. The history is more in Omashu maybe than Ba Sing Se. So is the Kingdom the Earth Kingdom of the Four Nations once Ba Sing Se forms? Or is it still valid to be part of the Four Nations when Ba Sing Se isn't quite there yet? There's questions like that I'd love to see the storytelling of, like, basically, is there a set point in history where like there is a treaty of like, we are now establishing these Four Nations as being officially the Four Nations, and the leaders at that set point in time agree to this? Or is it just like a historical distinction that historians effectively look back and just decide that, yes, this era is when we think of the Fire Nation, the Water Tribes, the Earth Kingdom, and the Air Nomads as being in their sort of classical modern forms to a certain degree that we know them to be. And prior to this point, one or maybe multiple of the nations was not in a state that we would associate it as being like the modern version of itself. With, again, the idea being that the nations have their own individual histories. And so the Four Nations as like a grouping also has their histories, and we just don't know what exactly like the overlap is and specifically when all this happens. But I hope this video was at least somewhat interesting to you guys, because we got a little bit into the weeds to explain a somewhat complicated connection. Because I'm sure maybe some of you have been on the Avatar wiki and you randomly see that date. What is it? It's I think it's 3829 BG in relation to like Guru Lahima and stuff like that. And that basically is this. This is what we're kind of talking about here when we do this. This is this Zier line about 4,000 years, just adjusted to account for like other dates. It effectively is just subtracting all of the years from the moment it is said to get us to 0 BG, which is like Korra's age, Aang's age, and the 100 Years in Ice gets us to that 3,800 number. It's complicated, and you can see how there's a ton of history about the Avatar world we know absolutely nothing about, but that's super interesting to speculate about. And for anyone who maybe says stuff like, oh, are you worried about like them overdoing Avatar if they have multiple projects into the future? I think a video like this, where there's so much vagueness about like a lot of the history, we have 10,000 years to cover, theoretically. We've got a lot of stuff we can do, and that includes giant kind of historical moments, formation of nations, if we go into the past, let alone the idea that we can still go forward into post-Korra and see what happens in the next era also. But that's everything I think I wanted to say here in this video. So let me know what your thoughts are on the concept of like pre-Four Nations as a timeline. What do you think the idea is? When does this specifically happen? What is the more specific year on specifically when the Four Nations are the Four Nations? Do you think it is in or around like Lahima and 4,000 years ago? Or is it much more recent? I definitely want to know your guys' thoughts on that and what the significant like historical detail is surrounding why is it that point when they're finally considered the Four Nations versus something else? Who is the last nation to become themselves? And then also, of course, Avatar Zalir. What are your thoughts on us finally getting an Avatar more in the giant gap between Wan and like Gun, Salai, Zito, that sort of thing? Do you think we will get more on her in the future? Or just let me know. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.